this is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to the making and the remaking of Codependent Mind.
We're going to revisit a topic that we covered a while back now, way back at the beginning of season 3, the subject of boundaries.
And we're going to do it just in time for the holidays.
That's right. Yeah, this is something that comes up for everyone, at least to some extent, over the holidays.
Last time we talked about it, it was somewhat of a theoretical discussion, and we were both a little bit new to thinking about boundaries and using that concept and that word in our relationship.
It was very, especially foreign to me. We had prepped for it, but had totally different ideas about it going into it. And I walked away. It took me the entire episode to grasp really a better concept for it. We've since included it in the book also, a little discussion about boundaries. But again, this idea of personal boundaries.
And then you're working on a second book specifically about relationships, how to have a relationship with a recovering codependent. And of course, boundaries come up in that book as well. So we wanted just to do both a recap and then maybe talk a little bit more specifically about how boundaries work, say in our relationship and then in relationships in general. So just to do that kind of recap from season 3, episode 1, what we were trying to convey in that episode is that boundaries are a metaphor. It's supposed to be a useful metaphor, but unfortunately, it seems to often confuse people more than it helps them.
I think so, right. People overcomplicate it.
So let's talk about how that metaphor works. And I think like we did in that previous episode, starting with a physical example, because that's where the word emerges from. The metaphor emerges from these physical examples. Like entities in the world have boundaries. They are bounded. So that's things like a forest will have a boundary, a park will have a boundary, a plot of land will have a boundary, a nation will have a boundary expressed as a border.
So it's taking this image of there being an end to this entity and then the start of another entity. So, as far as people, individuals being I, myself, my body is about my boundary.
Is your physical boundary. So right. That's a little more clear to understand how each of us are individual bounded physical entities.
We're separate.
My body is separate and distinct from your body. And then from there, again, treating it as a metaphor, we can say we have other boundaries as well. So our emotional life, our mental life, those things, our psychological life, those things are also bounded.
They're part of that same boundary.
And they're separate. You have yours and I have mine. So one thing when we talk about, say, countries or states that again have clear boundaries, we talk about the sovereignty of those states, the absolute right and authority to govern themselves. So we all, as bounded individuals, have the absolute right and authority to govern ourselves, to control our physical bodies, to control our mental spaces, and to control our emotional spaces.
Right. Yeah, and then the key here is the right to.
We're going to argue that that's an inalienable right, which is a word we're probably all familiar with from the American Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, right.
So an inalienable right is a right that cannot be taken away and cannot be given away.
So in the Declaration of Independence, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes, among others, but those are the ones it calls out.
Those are the ones they chose
as far as I remember,
in there. Right.
And so you see in those, again, the ways in which those are rights that cannot be given up. There's no way to alienate yourself from your right to life, your right to liberty, and your right to the pursuit of happiness. So this is a concept of sovereignty over one's self, of having a self made up of a physical body, of a psychological and emotional body, and your right to govern that self is inalienable. We have sovereignty over ourselves. So part of that is, again, our physical and mental and emotional spaces, but also things that are a product of ourselves.
So being things like your money, your time, your sexuality,
your labor, all of these things you have sovereignty over. So if you think about what does sovereignty or boundaries need to continue to exist in the world? They need to be protected and respected. I mean, that's essentially what the Declaration of Independence was saying, that our sovereignty was not being protected or respected. Critically, though, it is not about how other people treat, it's not about controlling or changing other people's behavior. Boundary work, sovereignty, is about how you respond to the way they treat you. It's your response.
Right. So the respect really needs to start with yourself, self-respect.
Because there are people out there, for sure, who you need to protect yourself. There are people out there ready to disrespect you. It would be great if that wasn't the case. We wouldn't need boundaries. We wouldn't need borders. We wouldn't need any kind of these conceptions if we all just kind of naturally respected each other and did not try to violate each other's sovereignty.
So it's understanding how to keep that in mind, just that I am a sovereign individual and I need to respect, regardless of how other people are behaving towards me, I need to continue to respect the fact that I am a sovereign individual.
And to protect yourself.
And to protect myself.
And of those two, it's about protecting and respecting the sovereign self. I think the protection part is a little more straightforward in that it's easier to conceptualize.
Yes, I can visualize what protecting a boundary would look like. Protecting a boundary would be actually someone's asking something of me that intrudes on my time, my emotional space, something like that. And I don't want to do what is being asked of me. So protecting myself is not doing it.
So that would be protecting your time, for instance, or maybe protecting your labor.
Right.
But there's also more extreme cases where your physical body needs to be protected. Your emotional health needs to be defended. Your mental health needs to be defended. And in those cases, protecting might look like leaving the conversation, leaving the situation, and maybe even leaving the relationship. But these are all examples of playing defense, because to reiterate, boundary work, protecting your sovereignty, is about how you respond to other people's behaviors. It's not an offensive incursion into their sovereignty. That's what narcissists do. So those would be some examples of protecting. Examples of respecting yourself, that's a little trickier. What does, in terms of what does that look like? You struggle with that, especially early on in this process.
Right. Well, all the way back. I remember early conversations about self-respect, and I didn't really understand it. I mean, I didn't really think about boundaries at all, but I don't think the first time we talked about it, we weren't necessarily talking about boundaries, but we kind of were, actually. This is the
whole thing that boundaries is a metaphor. So when we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about respecting and protecting yourself. That's what we're talking about, right? It's not that you have to explicitly use the word boundary. It's that boundaries are standing in for what it means to be a sovereign person who respects themselves and who protects themselves.
I think the early conversation we had was related, because there was some crossover where I was still ending my relationship with Jay when we met. And you were observing a lot of behaviors where I would say I didn't want to do X, or just I was allowing something. I say, this is not something that I agree with.
Well, altogether, she didn't treat you well consistently. And I questioned your self-respect.
And I remember thinking, well, yeah, I respect myself. And the first thing my brain went to at the time was just, I'm not depressed anymore or something. So I don't have negative self-talk. I don't criticize myself.
Well, you didn't just think that. You said that. That was your response to me.
Right. That's when I thought of the word respect. That's all I thought of. I don't berate myself.
Yeah. So you kind of articulated or argued that you had that in the past that was a problem for you, but now it wasn't. You did respect yourself, and you seemed to think it was because you thought well of yourself, that you didn't have this negative self-talk.
But then it's like, okay, but your actions don't actually line up with that. So with someone who respects themselves. Exactly.
So respecting yourself needs to be behavior, not just this internal dialogue.
Yeah, because it was actually pretty easy. I mean, not easy, but to just convince myself that I'm sure I'm a good person. Or it was simple to have just positive self-talk. But if my actions don't line up with it, then what does it mean? I
mean, I thought about it back then, but we just more recently have tried to think, what does it mean to respect yourself? So we came up with kind of a list of examples. So I respect myself when I act according to my values.
I respect myself when I demonstrate care and concern for my emotional and physical well-being.
I respect myself when I surround myself with people who treat me and others well.
I respect myself when I prioritize my needs and my desires.
I respect myself when I express myself honestly and authentically.
And I respect myself when I do not accept shame and blame for things that are not under my control.
And maybe I'll put these examples in the show notes, and I would love if people could add to it, because I think this can be ambiguous for many of us, is how to act in a way that's respectful to ourselves.
Yes, that's the hard part. I think that was the hard part for me, and I think the hard part for a lot of people is the actual action of self-respect.
Well, and part of the codependency, all these codependent habits are in many ways, like we've said in these previous episodes, they're inauthentic, and they involve and sometimes require a betrayal of yourself. And these were habitual. So you habitually disrespected yourself, treated yourself with a lack of respect in order to treat others with the respect that they thought they deserved.
Right. So we talk about it's lying at the core. It's dishonesty at the core. It's also lack of respect, self-respect at the core.
So this is something that you've worked on, is respecting yourself through your behavior and your actions.
So yeah, there's a couple of examples of where I did this earlier on when self-respect was still a major struggle for me. But one example being my final communication with Jay. In the last 3 to 6 months of, going through the divorce process, she was starting to get really demanding and threatening in a way that I was starting to open my eyes to, and it was causing a lot of fear and shame. But at some point I started to understand what it meant to respect myself in response to that. And I don't remember really thinking of it as boundaries at the time, but I was not responding. I wasn't responding to any of her texts or calls or emails, and it was repeated, and it was very escalating and violent language. And I'm going to come to your house, and I'm going to sit outside your door, all this kind of stuff.
And even after you were divorced, even post-divorce, this continued from her. So yeah, you weren't thinking of it as boundaries. You didn't have that language, but that's what it was. It was about, at that point, you weren't responding. You were protecting yourself, at least.
By not responding. Yes. And that's how it felt, basically. I was protecting myself. Just like nothing good is going to come out of me responding.
So at least you started to do that. You started to set that boundary, because that was a large dynamic in that relationship, was that if she texted or she reached out to you, you respond.
I responded. It was expected that I did not just respond, but respond immediately, no matter what I was doing, or that would become part of the assault.
And even though you were divorcing, and even post-divorce, that was still her expectation. Right. She felt she was still entitled to your time and your response whenever she wanted it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was not doing that. It continued, and then it took a little break for a little while, and then it started up again, and finally I decided I was just going to say just something about how the relationship was toxic, and I felt as though she was taking advantage of me the entire time, and I was taking back my self-respect. That's basically all I said.
And it's interesting you use that word.
I know it is. It is, because I think we were having some of these conversations at the time about self-respect, and it was really starting to sink in. It was still very hard. A lot of it was fear-based still, but I did understand. It was sinking in what that meant in that context.
And interestingly, that worked. I mean, so that can be thought of as setting a boundary, acting in a way that protects your self-respect. And you only got, maybe one more?
Yeah, 1 or 2 more.
And then that was it.
Yeah.
She kind of did the whole, fine.
Right.
Whatever.
I know, right? Yeah, fine. Oh, just one last word from me. Yeah. Yeah, and then there was one that we mentioned in the previous episode when we talked about boundaries was a coworker one, which was it was another early one where there was a certain coworker that every time she called me, it was very predictable. It was very combative.
On her part.
On her part, yes, right. Yeah, it wasn't just a combative conversation. So I caught on to the fact that the only time she actually called, because there's emails and everything else, the only time she called was when she wanted to find out a way in which she could blame someone for something. So she had this kind of knack for putting people on the spot and trying to make them nervous and admit to guilt about something, so that she can then take that statement and then bring it to whoever other person that she had to have an uncomfortable conversation. Well, so-and-so said it was their fault that this happened. Or whatever,
Yeah, so she didn't have to take responsibility. She was looking for someone to...
Yeah, it was always looking for someone to blame. That in a very, very like combative, it was totally useless when it came to the whole work environment, and it was toxic. So I decided I wasn't going to take her calls anymore for that reason. We can do business through email. Like this, the fact that every single call, this was the point of the call, then I wasn't going to take them. I had no reason to call her. So I said this to her, I'm not taking your calls anymore. Yeah, it was something about like these are counterproductive, something like that. These are counterproductive calls, so I'm not going to take these calls anymore. And so I didn't. I mean, and years went by, and she tried a few times, but didn't try anymore. And look, we still got stuff done.
Right, exactly. Work went on. Although recently you tested the waters a little bit.
Yes. Because I was just feeling very, like, okay, it's been a while, whatever, it's fine. I felt like it would go differently, or I would be able to handle it differently or something. But yeah, no, I was like, so she called, took the call. Oops.
Same thing.
Exactly the same thing. So I was
but
like,
you,
yeah, right.
You did say you felt that you were better able to respect yourself in that conversation, and say what you wanted to say.
Yeah, it was still very uncomfortable, and I was very put on the spot, and it made me anxious. But ultimately, by the end of the call, I felt as though I was conscious of self-respect. I was conscious of my boundaries, and
you didn't feel you let yourself be taken advantage of, or that you said anything to her that was compromising.
Right, which is what I used to do. In all the years, because I've been working with this person for at least 10 years. Yeah.
So that last one we said, actually, I don't accept shame or blame for things not under my control. Part of what you would do in those past conversations with this coworker was to essentially accept blame that wasn't, because she was looking for someone to blame so she could go to the client and not have to take responsibility herself.
Exactly.
And you would take that on even if it wasn't your fault.
Yeah, that was the whole point of those, and I was happy to provide that. That's what I provided for people at the time.
Right. As you're saying, both of these situations where you set a boundary, that is, protected and respected yourself, it's not that felt great. There was a lot of fear and anxiety around that, and that's probably what's going to happen for many people who are not accustomed to protecting themselves or prioritizing or respecting themselves in interactions. I mean, it happens to those of us who are more practiced at it, because it does involve potentially making someone angry, potentially making someone disappointed. Not making someone, I shouldn't use that word. It involves someone being disappointed, someone being angry, someone being sad. And for a lot of people with codependent habits, they would rather themselves be sad or angry or disappointed or upset than have someone else in the room be that way.
It somehow feels easier, right? When faced with either shame or fear, it's almost like fear wins in the moment. And then, of course, the shame becomes crushing.
It's because you've
just betrayed yourself.
You've betrayed yourself, right? So the protect and the respect really need to go together. Protection is important, and sometimes it's the only thing you can do, but really it's only the first step. Protecting yourself doesn't necessarily mean you're respecting yourself.
I have an example from those same early days of a time that I protected myself, but I didn't respect myself. And this is a really common thing I think people do with boundaries, is it's kind of just like a way around the respect part. After Jay and I had decided to get divorced, she still wanted to go on a trip with me to Mexico, and was pushing hard for this trip.
Free trip to Mexico.
Just like, one more trip. Let's take one more trip,
On your dime.
Yeah. I remember her saying, we could talk through logistics of the divorce or whatever. Like,
how much money are you going to give me?
While we relax on the beach and you pay for it. And I didn't want to do this trip at all. And so I dragged this out for a while, just kind of not really disagreeing or agreeing or not agreeing to it. Just kind of dragged it out for a while, just nervous about.
Well, you had, it was booked. I mean, you had, right?
Yeah. I booked it. Right. I booked it prior to the divorce discussions. I was pretty much like, well, I guess I'm going to have to go on this trip. That's kind of how I was proceeding with this, because I didn't know what else to do. Like, well, I can't suddenly change my mind now, just because we were getting a divorce, So the trip was coming up, and I really did not want to go on this trip, but I was not making that clear at all. And the trip was coming up. And so finally I had to make the decision to tell her that I wasn't going on the trip. So I protected myself by finally saying, I'm not going on this trip. But the way I did it was not respecting myself, because I came up with an excuse for why I couldn't go. So rather than, no, I don't want to go on this trip, we're getting a divorce, I don't want to go on a trip with you. There were so many reasons like that. Those were the real reasons. But the reason I gave was I can't go on the trip because work is really busy right now. It's just going to be too hard. I won't have time to travel there, to relax at all. Work is just too much right now, so I can't do this.
And she was still pissed off, but you had given her an excuse that you felt she couldn't argue for it, which is, again, why it's not respecting yourself. Because you're saying, I don't have the authority to make the decision myself over my time, my labor, my body. My body doesn't want to go to Mexico. I don't have the authority to say, I'm not going to Mexico. You have to invoke this other authority, this work, to counteract her authority. Like, everyone else has authority but you.
Right.
You don't respect your own authority. You respect work's authority, and you were counting on her. You knew she wouldn't respect you. But you were counting on that she would respect the authority of your work.
Right.
Least.
Well, this is how he makes his money, and then he has to do what these people are telling him. So, all right. So really, and this is something that, I didn't even do that much for the majority of that relationship. So at least I did protect myself. But yeah, there was no respect in that. And if I were to say, oh, I'm a person that sets boundaries now, if I set them like that, first of all, that's a lie. I'm being dishonest. I'm being inauthentic. Even though I'm protecting myself, I'm still being inauthentic. And I'm punting, right? I'm giving this person the idea that, well, I would have done this, but sorry, I can't.
Because of work.
It's because of work. It's not because I don't want to. So go ahead and ask me again 6 months from now or something else.
Which she did. She continued to expect that your time and your resources and your body would be available to her. And again, protecting yourself is important. Absolutely. And if that's the first step, and if that's what you need to do, and if that's all you can do, fine. But the point here is your sovereign self deserves better. You deserve to be respected in addition to being protected. In fact, you are entitled to respect. And entitlement is something that we've talked a bit about in terms of narcissism as one of the major flags, this deep sense of entitlement. So it's been kind of a bad word, but we want to rescue that word. And one way to do that is to think about Aristotle. We're going to bring him up again. He had this conception of the golden mean. And what the golden mean is a middle point between, as he described it, an excess and a deficiency. He talked about the golden mean in terms of virtues specifically. So the example of courage, that's a classical virtue, but that doesn't mean the more courage, the better. If you have an excess of courage, then you're just reckless. If you have a deficiency of courage, then you're a coward. So what Aristotle argued we should aim for is this golden mean being another word for average, that rests between excess and deficiency. And I think it's a really helpful way to think about a lot of behaviors. For instance, the caretaking behaviors, this golden mean between excessive caretaking and not caring at all. And then also entitlement. So what we have with narcissism is this excess of entitlement, where they're entitled not just to their own sovereignty, they're entitled to all the rest of us as well. And then with codependency, we have this deficiency of entitlement, where there's a feeling that you're not even entitled to your own wants, your own needs, your own desires, your own time, your own thoughts.
Right. And you could see exactly, again, we've talked about several times before, how those two work so well together.
They balance each other out.
Right. That's a different kind of
yeah, it's not the
ground.
Golden mean. What would that be?
So it's not the individual that's created the mean. It's the pairing. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's stability in that, but it's terrible. It's toxic stability. So the golden mean of entitlement is this pathway to self-respect. Having self-respect is having that balanced amount of entitlement.
Yeah, recognizing what you're entitled to, going all the way back to the beginning here, you're entitled to that right of sovereignty because, as you said, it's inalienable. It can't be taken away. It can't be given. This is, once again, where self-knowledge is really important because I have to understand enough about myself to know what it is I'm respecting.
So you have to know, for instance, you would have to know that you didn't want to go to Mexico.
Yes, exactly. Right. Which means I need to understand my emotions, that what my emotions are telling me. Like, oh, my emotions are telling me, no, this is a terrible idea. But when I'm not listening to my emotions, I could misinterpret that as something else. Oh, I'm nervous because of work.
Previous episode was on self-knowledge, and this is why, because it is foundational to doing a lot of this work, including boundary work. And we said, I think this in the original boundary episode as well, that you have to have a distinct self. You do have a distinct self, but you have to understand that distinction in order to protect and respect it. So that's, I guess, fairly long recap.
Yeah, of personal boundaries.
Personal boundaries. But we wanted to talk about boundaries in relationships because, as the famous poem says, no man is an island. We have interactions daily with other sovereign selves, and we share space, we share emotional energy, and we have to find a way to do that so that everyone's sovereignty in that system is still respected and protected.
So this is inescapable. I mean, in society.
Fortunately, there's a lot of cultural customs that govern those daily interactions. So customs surrounding how we greet each other, how we share food, how we practice religion. So, I mean, for instance, greetings, right? I mean, we're crossing each other's physical boundaries.
That's true, right? A lot of times we shake hands or something. We're actually touching.
Yeah. So in our cultures, we shake hands. There's cultures where they exchange kisses on a cheek. There's some cultures where they exchange kisses on two cheeks. There's hugging. And these are, again, so we don't have to figure out each of us individually every time our boundaries push up against each other. We don't have to figure out how to do that. Again, we have these cultural customs that help us negotiate those situations in a way in which people still feel respected and protected, even though they're allowing incursions into their physical space or their emotional space, etc. But then when we enter into the world of romantic relationships, obviously these are much more complex negotiations because we're just covering a lot more ground.
Yeah, every boundary you have is going to be interacted with.
So we're going to use a construct that we had a whole episode on again in maybe it was season 4. I can link to that episode as well. It was the you, me, us episode. So this is a construct that we think is helpful. We found it helpful in our relationship is to remind ourselves that between the two of us, there are actually 3 entities that need to be respected and protected. So obviously there's you, there's me, but the relationship itself needs respect, protection, and care. And we talk about in that episode that what we want to do with the relationship is to create a relationship in which we both feel safe, connected, and cared for. We used the metaphor in that, or analogy maybe, in that episode of a house. The relationship is like the home that we share and that we both deserve, feel safe and cared for in. But we're still within that structure. There are still 2 of us, 2 separate individuals. And then there's the shared relationship.
And that can be so hard for people with a history of codependent behaviors and enmeshment to keep that in mind, that separation. Because it's so tempting to just go, well, everything's we now. There's no me anymore.
So enmeshment is more about sacrificing yourself, not protecting, respecting yourself, your own needs and desires, and just protecting the other person. Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah, what's going to sustain, okay, this person is asking for things, so that's my job.
My job is to make sure this person never feels bad, the person's never hurt, the person's never confused, they get everything they want and that they need. But that's not your job. Your job is to do that for you. Their job is to do that for them. And then we have this relationship that we share that we hope nourishes us both.
And then we both are taking the self-awareness and knowledge and our own self-respect and saying, this is what I need.
Each person, again, is still sovereign. They still have absolute right to govern themselves. But there is now also this relationship entity that needs to be respected. So how does that work?
Right, because it can't just mirror one person's needs. Otherwise, it's just that one person's needs. It's not a separate entity.
So to talk through some more concrete examples. One example might be of one person having relationships with people of the other sex. Like say me, for instance, I have very close friends that are men.
Yeah, that may me uncomfortable. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable in relationships when their partner has that kind of relationship. It may feel like a threat. In my case, it doesn't, but it could. And so I would need to communicate that. I would need to be honest with that, about that, and tell you why it makes me feel unsafe and that it makes me feel unsafe. And then you have a right to your own opinion on that. And well, these relationships are important to me.
Yes, I need to communicate back my feelings, which might be these relationships are important to me. They don't feel like they're taking anything away from the relationship. In fact, these are the ways I understand them as adding to the relationship. And again, we're talking about the relationship, not that whether my behavior is bad or good, or whether your behavior is bad or good, because it seems like people get very hung up on that level. They want to have their feelings validated. Is it okay that I feel threatened by my partner having opposite sex friendships? And the other person, is it okay for me to want be friends with people from the opposite sex? Yes. Answer to both. Yes.
It is.
It's always okay to feel what you're feeling. The feelings are information. You take those feelings to the discussion, and then you figure out what needs to happen at the relationship level to make everyone feel safe and connected and cared for in that relationship.
Yeah, so as long as you're both being honest in this discussion, you're starting from the right place. You're being honest, you know yourself well enough, you're being vulnerable enough to express it, knowing that the other person may go, you know what? That's a deal breaker for me. So that's really risky to be vulnerable like that.
Well, and yeah, so there's a number of options that can come out of that conversation. One or both of us might decide that we can't be ourselves in this relationship. We can't respect ourselves in this relationship. So you may decide you can't, for whatever reason, is not respectful of yourself. It's too emotionally damaging. It's too, whatever it is, scary for you to be in a relationship with someone who has friends of the opposite sex. And then what you need to do is, if I decide those are important to me, then you need to leave. Similarly, I might say, well, then I can't be in a relationship with someone who doesn't accept that part of me. Or we could come together and figure out that there is a relationship boundary that is respectful of both of our feelings and both of our needs. And so it might be, well, I'm very open with you about what those relationships look like, what we talk about. Maybe I'll let you see the communications if that makes you feel better. And maybe we decide, yeah, if we have friends, either of us have friends of the opposite sex, maybe we won't travel together. Maybe that's a decision that we make together, a boundary around the relationship. So we do that negotiation at the relationship level.
Right. And then you can call that now a relationship boundary because we discussed this, we agreed on this. The important thing also is that these things may change. And we as individuals still need to always be looking inside at what our needs are. And we may decide a year down the road, no, this still isn't working for me. Even the way we agreed on this. Now I need to bring that to you. Or
you may decide, oh, actually, now I know a lot more about these relationships you have with other people. I don't find them threatening. We don't need any kind of guardrails in place.
Let's open it up even more. I'm totally fine with the way you had originally expressed. I'm comfortable with that now.
Exactly. So the relationship boundaries can change because, again, we're using boundaries as code word for what needs to be in place to protect and respect the relationship and to protect and respect the people in it. So that's going to change because our needs are going to change. The relationship needs are going to change and the needs of the individuals within the relationship are going to change. Sometimes people use boundaries their own or the word as kind of bludgeon, as a way to impose rules on people. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not about controlling or changing other people's behavior, even at the relationship level. It's like, what does this relationship need? And every relationship is going to be different because every relationship is going to involve two different sovereign selves. So what does this particular relationship need in order for the people in it to feel safe and connected and cared for? And we're going to do an episode on relationship structure at a different point because the boundaries of each relationship are going to look different.
So again, back to the negotiation part of it. Yeah, it requires self-awareness, but it also requires self-respect. It requires the active self-respect. So if I am afraid now, I'm afraid to be vulnerable. I'm afraid to be honest because I don't know what's going to happen. How are you going to respond to it? So instead, I'm going to go ahead and agree to this boundary, even though I actually internally disagree with it.
And you had kind of pretty explicit example of that because you and Jay did open your marriage and you had supposedly discussions of what that would look and what you would need to do to protect the relationship under those conditions.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of nice that I have that example because the rest of the relationship with her was just her imposing rules and me following them, which this kind of was too, but this more resembled a relationship boundary discussion. Because I remember there was like a meeting about it when they talked about, couples that have open relationships should have agreements in place. Make sure that they are on the same page about what actions should or shouldn't be taken for the sake of their relationship. And so we did that, except it resembled the way our normal discussions would take place, as she would say, I think the rules need to be this, this, and this. And my usual approach to that was, okay.
Whatever you say. So the rules were really about protecting and respecting her.
Well, so there were a couple in particular that I really was like, made me very uncomfortable. I just immediately, I pictured going through with these rules and was just like, I don't agree with these. And so I don't agree with them, but I went ahead and agreed with them.
So what would be one?
One of them was we have to always, if we go out with another person, we have to always split the bill. Like everything has to be paid, split, no matter what. And
let's dial in on that because the rules we're saying are supposed to be about protecting, respecting the relationship. And how does you not being able to pay for someone else's dinner protect the relationship or respect the relationship you have with her? Because first of all, you made almost all the money.
Yeah. Well, at the time the rules came up, I made all the money.
So you made all the money. So it's essentially her saying you're not allowed to spend money on anyone else.
Yeah,
but
your
me.
money on it.
But me. So again, it's protecting her and respecting her, but it's not clear in which way how the relationship itself won't survive if you take someone else out to dinner.
Yeah. So I think the unconscious side of my disagreement came from that like what right do you have to impose how I spend my money? But I didn't, that was too much for me to try to think about. So really all I did think about was just how uncomfortable it was. But I was going to go ahead and enforce this rule. And I did. Every time I went on a date, I wouldn't say it until like the last minute, which is extremely rude. And I asked somebody out. I choose the place. It may be kind of an expensive restaurant. And then at the last minute, the bill comes. Oh, by the way, one of my rules with my partner is that we split the bill 50-50. Wah, wah. So that's one, yeah. And
that was a case of you not respecting yourself or anyone else, actually.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah. I know. So yeah, I didn't agree with this rule, but I went ahead and not only agreed to it with her, I went ahead and enforced it too.
But you then you also, I imagine, were resentful.
Yes.
So this is the whole protection and respection, right? Mm-hmm. You were protecting that relationship for sure. Yeah. And you were trying to protect yourself in that relationship, and that's fine. But you shouldn't be in a relationship where protecting yourself means lying to your partner. And we talked about this more in those lying episodes. Like that's a sign. If you're consistently lying to your partner in order to protect yourself and protect the relationship, there's something wrong with the relationship, or there's something wrong with your partner, or there's something wrong with you. Like maybe you're a shitty person who just lies to your partner.
Right.
But you weren't. So there you go. So the protect and respect, again, need to go together. That's what boundaries are about, protection and respect. And so what are some of the ways that we protect and respect our relationship?
One of them, just the kind of the classic, sexual exclusivity. So we've chosen as a couple to be monogamous. It may not always be the case, but that is our current agreement.
We also, in terms of finances, we've had a lot of discussions about how we want to arrange our finances, and we've decided on a completely transparent financial partnership where we're merged. So that's a relationship boundary or structure that we feel best protects the relationship and is respectful of the relationship. And then we're both also comfortable with that ourselves.
And then there's also things like family expectations. We've talked about the roles that our family plays in our shared life and our ideas for how we relate and the future of our family and the time we spend and things like that.
The ways in which we want to prioritize our relationship within that structure, the needs of our relationship.
And this will often involve several discussions about how we each feel about our families and our roles in our family, and we help each other with that emotionally and logistically. And
yeah, a lot of discussions. And those discussions are about What does our relationship need to be protected and respected in these family structures? What do we individually need to feel safe and respected within the larger family ecosystem? And that work has really paid off. In part, it has allowed you to continue and us to continue to have a good relationship with your parents, even though there are these struggles that we've talked about a lot during this podcast that go way back.
Right. Yeah. So, but it's been very nice to have a much more clear understanding of my family and our role in family. Just recently, actually, we had my parents come out to not just visit, but stay with us for 10 days, which is by far the longest I've ever been immersed with both of my parents like that. And, I was pretty confident in it because of the way we went into it, how much we talked about it, and the fact that we agreed to begin with that this was a boundary negotiation between us. Was how long do we want this to be? What works for us? And it just made sense. They had to travel so far to get here that, we suggested the 10 days. It was a very long trip. It was challenging in many ways. But
the visit, their stay was challenging for both of us. Yeah. And again, I felt confident as well because I felt we had done this quote unquote boundary work. We had talked a lot about how to make sure that in this somewhat challenging situation with these somewhat challenging people, we could still feel respected and protected. And that was needed work because they were in our spaces. So we needed to both feel comfortable disengaging when we needed to disengage, which I think we both did. We both felt comfortable protecting our own emotional health and mental well-being and physical. If I needed to take a nap, I needed to take a nap. If we needed as a couple to take a walk, we took a walk together and, reconnected. And
yeah, right. It was great. I mean, like that part of it, our relationship part of it, and the way we stayed in touch and took care of ourselves and our relationship was great. I mean, it felt like a complete success by the time the trip was over.
And this is the other nice thing about boundaries. It's kind of like that saying, good fences make good neighbors. You not heard that?
I don't think so. It sounds kind of familiar. Yeah.
With the idea is that if you have those boundaries in place, meaning if you have the capacity to respect and protect yourself, then you are actually able to stay in relationships more easily and to have interactions with people who are challenging or complicated. It doesn't always mean that you just cut everyone off. The more you are able to respect and protect yourself, to respect and protect the relationships in your life, then engaging with one of these people who don't have that clear sense of boundaries, who will try to mount incursions into your mental space, into your emotional space, try to be a drain on your resources. You don't have to get rid of them from your life because you have ways to protect yourself against those incursions.
And obviously it's gonna be different. There are some people that you will need to cut out.
Yes.
That are actually abusive intentionally, just bad people.
But your parents were not one of them.
They were not.
And we were able to have a good visit, even though they're still challenging people for you to be around, and for me as well, for a number of reasons.
Yeah. And if anything, really, it just made me feel good about, obviously my dad being one that is still very much, I was like, wow, these are the exact same behaviors that I've seen my entire life, all the way back to the time when my codependency formed. These are the exact same behaviors, but it's okay now.
Still doesn't feel great.
No, it doesn't feel great. No, it's emotional immaturity and just manage me at all times. But I don't have to manage him. I didn't need to. And my setting a boundary didn't cause the whole world to fall apart.
This is being intentional about how you interact with people and who you interact with. Understanding that, again, you're a sovereign human being. You get to make the choices, but also then you're responsible for the choices that you're making. And that your main job in any relationship is to respect and protect yourself. And you want the other person to do the same. And if you're forming a more long-term relationship, you want to build a relationship that itself is worth respecting and protecting.
Then you're placing equal emphasis now on, I'm respecting myself, I'm respecting the relationship, but I'm also respecting you. And it's this little ecosystem, this like one of those recycle symbols with the 3 arrows.
That's right. And authenticity is key to that structure, because if you're not bringing your authentic self, if there's not room for the authentic other, then the relationship is not going to be authentic, and it's not going to be worth respecting and protecting.
That's right.
I mean, yeah, we're not saying any and all relationships need to be respected and protected. Not at all. You build one worthy of your respect and protection. And that's what this season is about.
So with that in mind, good luck with the upcoming holidays.
That's true.
Actually being the fact that this episode is coming out on Thanksgiving.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving for those who celebrate. And, respect and protect yourself as best you can.
See you in a couple of weeks with another relationship tool.
Thanks for listening.